Okay. Welcome, everyone. I don't know if anyone in the back is still, if anyone's coming in, we're going to get started. I am going to go ahead and start us on time, though, because we are on candid camera. And let me. I didn't hear back from about not wanting this. Folks at home are streaming our formation discussions so that people can hear what we're talking about, and maybe that will elicit some questions from them if they have any as well, or maybe not. Either way, our folks have an opportunity to hear all of the discussion that we have. So today you may hear me sort of repeating back some of the things you've said, making sure that I got it right, or at least the summary of it, so that folks can hear. But otherwise, there are microphones that are live in this room, and without all the other equipment, your voice can probably be heard. So I'll just invite you all to speak as loudly as you can. We struggled a little bit with that last week, so just kind of speak up when you can. And if I think you're talking quietly, I'll just say, here's what I heard you say. Did I get it? Okay? So today is the session of our formation gathering where we're talking about the first 4 weeks of liturgy change that we went through. And so I brought a bulletin, and I hope that you all have yours. So again, inside the bulletins, as we go through these 4-week changes, at the first page, there's a description of what it is that we're doing and where the resources came from. So for clarity, if any of you wondered, or if anyone at home wondered, this liturgy created that. I have plenty of things to say grace over every day, and this material has been written for the Episcopal Church, and this particular one comes from our worship. And that was a source that was written many decades ago and has been used for special services along the way. And so I deployed it as our first trial run because it's one of the liturgies that is most resembling what is in the Book of Common Prayer. But what I suspect all of you noted is that there are some pretty distinct shifts in language. Most of that language shift is about creating what the church describes as open and expansive language, rather than what you find in the prayer book, which has always been, since its writing, what we would describe as gendered language. What do I mean by that? God the Father, God the Son, lots of use of the he pronoun throughout, right? So there has been a shift in church over time to try to create some language for our liturgies that invites other people into that dialogue that might otherwise have some challenges with that traditional language. So that's what you see here, together with prayers from the New Zealand prayer book that make up the liturgy in the exact same shape as what we are used to having. So the structure was the same. The words were a little different. So, what did you think about enriching our worship prayer 2? What's on your heart? And I'll try to address every question that I can, and if I don't know, well, I'll just tell you I don't know. This particular one, yep, that's right, Graham. This particular prayer comes from the resource Enriching Our Worship, and just like our prayer book, it has multiple forms. This one is prayer 2. There are several. I think that there are 3, and then there are other formulations around special times that you can change collects, and you can change the different prayers themselves for like prayers of the people. I didn't use prayer of people from Enriching Our Worship with this. I mixed 2 resources because we're in that practice of New Zealand, so I wanted to stay there for a second. It's just like our prayer book. It's a tiny little booklet that you can flip through. It has a similar design and rubric. Well, I think, no, not exactly. The question was, would we be choosing prayer 1, 2, or 3? No. What I was interested in was beginning what another form of prayer, in this case, specifically with open language. So how would the people of St. David's experience a Eucharistic prayer that didn't have he pronouns throughout? And so that's why this one is selected. You would find a very, very similar style in the other prayers for enriching our worship, but just like our prayer book, when you get to see, it gets real long, real wordy. The same thing happens. To be quite honest with you, I selected prayer 2 because we have some time constraints, particularly at the 8 a.m. service, and I wanted to make sure that enough that service and practice times weren't interrupted. So that's why you got prayer 2. Question. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Yeah. So the question is, can I give some insight to the New Zealand prayer book, which is in this iteration is where the prayers of the people have come from. I believe it's where the prayers of the people have come from since about week 2 of my being here. The New Zealand prayer book is one of the church's early examples of a province of the Episcopal Church. So think, a political geographic footprint, making a decision to create a prayer book that spoke to the needs of its own people. So New Zealand has, for a very long time, together with the Scottish prayer book, has been an example of what it means for a diocese, a province, to be active in the work of creating modern language for their prayers. The New Zealand prayer book is named what it is because it's the province of New Zealand, which covers New Zealand and a lot of little island territories right around there. The book is designed with language that they have in mind, and you'll get a little bit more of that description in this page coming in the next weeks because we're shifting to a New Zealand liturgy with different prayers. But the language is highly poetic, it's very modern, and it's meant to awaken a curiosity that makes sense to the people. If you're holding a New Zealand prayer book, and if you ever want to, I have one in my office. I think they're really interesting books because they're bilingual. So they are written in English, and below it are translations into the native language of islanders in that province, which is just the most interesting thing in the world. You will never hear me try to butcher their language because that would be cultural appropriation, but it's very fascinating to see those languages side by side. So the New Zealand prayer book was created for a couple of reasons. One was to say to the church that the prayers that we pray together are living, and they speak to us in the current moment. And the other one was to protect and keep alive a culture that was dying. So you could see where that can be a really interesting and, dare I say, dangerous prospect for the grander Anglican Church, which is built, of course, on the language that we know, English. So this was a way of holding on to the roots of who we were while sort of breaking or at least challenging the colonial ties to how the Anglican Church came to exist in New Zealand. It was the same scenario in the Scottish prayer book, and those are there's a rebellious and playful nature even in the American Church because, of course, without bishops from Scotland, we would not have bishops in the colonies, which means we would not have an American Episcopal Church. So all these things kind of come together theologically that made me go, this could be a really interesting prayer for us to take a look at. Most of the time, you see prayers from New Zealand at very special services, and I say special with air quotes here, one-off services. So think vigils are a very special midweek service because a lot of clergy really love that language. But for a very long time, it was absolutely barred from use inside the Episcopal Church during a regular Sunday service. And that is because in the U.S. Episcopal Church, and beyond that in the United Kingdom, we still held to a very tight polity that the prayer book was the book, right? And we trace that all the way back to some really gruesome battles in the church. And so with that theology in mind, it became very, very difficult for there to be changes proposed to the prayer book. So in order for that to happen, it had to be presented on a certain timeline, then it had to be presented at General Convention, and then it had to go through a 3-year at least cycle of review, which you probably all could remember, or at least some of you can remember when you used to have those black and white books in your... So in the Episcopal Church, when we're trying on a new liturgy, you get a whole new book, and they print it and bind it, and they put it in your congregations for a period of time, and then they review it with you. And then it goes back to convention, and then it has to be voted on, and it just becomes this huge deal. So for a very long time, all the proposals that were made for prayer book revision always failed, because eventually what happens is a resolution would move from the common house in General Convention, so lay delegates and priests, into the House of Bishops. And bishops have a very different job than priests. One of the vows that a bishop takes is that they will defend the faith. And there are many bishops who take that vow very, very seriously, even when they don't necessarily agree with the words that they might be defending. And yet they would say, the prayer book is the book, my job is to defend the faith, and therefore this revision goes nowhere. And it didn't take very many votes for revisions to fail. So in the academy and seminaries, there have been people that have been proposing changes to the prayer book for decades and decades, and yet we're stuck. So recently, what started as a bit of a punt in the General Convention was a couple of bishops. You know one of them. His name is Jeff Lee. The other bishop is Bishop Andy Doyle from Texas. And the two of them together formed a liturgy pact. And they started looking at all these things. And what they did is they got all the bishops around them to go, you know, we need to protect our book. And they said, yes, of course, we should protect the book. So let's make it a historical document that is no longer changeable. But we need to approve all these other experimental liturgies that have been sitting on the shelf, and we don't want to send them through if we don't have to change the book anymore. You can use whatever you want. And literally overnight, hundreds of pages of new liturgies were available to the Episcopal Church in the United States with the full weight and effect of the prayer book. But all the people that defend that faith were safe because their prayer book is now unchangeable. And suddenly everyone was happy. I didn't know that could happen, but they definitely pleased all sides. So that's why suddenly you get these liturgies that before the last 4 weeks or so, I might have pulled a prayer out, our prayers of the people, which are always available for us in the prayer book to change. But now suddenly you have the whole liturgy available to you and available for you to look at critically. That's a windy answer, I'm sorry. So this prayer book, I can give you, I don't want to misquote it, I'll give you the exact date of its publication, but it would have been post-Vatican II. So it's one of these, sort of the modern church movement after that, and it's around that same time that we were looking at Revised Common Lectionary. It's sort of like the postmodern period for the church, sort of where we are right now. The quick answer is yes, but they still have to follow the polity, which means even now presenting experimental liturgies is incredibly difficult. And I will tell you off cuff, I don't think that you will see any more significant changes proposed, at least not for quite some time, because these languished forever. And most of the questions that academics and theologians might share about these liturgies and their need have actually been addressed in them. And so, requests for gender inclusivity and for more expansive understandings of God and God's correct salutation are all in there. And so when you think, what's the thing they'd be looking for next? I don't know. because all of that liturgy is right, and all of the pastoral offices are now corrected as well. So this ruling included a universal language in liturgies for the blessing of same-sex unions, of civil unions, of marriages now that have really beautiful liturgies. I did a wedding a couple of weeks ago, and the couple finally was able to select a New Zealand prayer for their wedding liturgy, which is absolutely stunning. And you can read all this, and you can look them up online and take a look at them. But I good evidence. I have no idea what another academic or theologian would look for in liturgy, so I have a hard time imagining there's more coming. But I imagine that there will be a theologian, 20 or 25 years from now that has a whole newfangled idea, and there probably would be people that could latch onto that. So we'll wait and see. Melissa, I think you had something. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So let me just recap for people that can't. So on page 16 of the bulletin, the opening portion of the Eucharistic prayer, we praise you and bless you, holy and gracious God, source of life abundant. Your Spirit moved over the deep and brought all things into being. And you are correct, Melissa, in that ties directly to the oldest creation story. And so it's the story of the Spirit brooding over the deep, as Genesis would say, and moving over the waters. Yeah. A week or...
Okay, I was looking at the one from this week, that's why.
Sorry, yeah. So yes, these are interesting ties, and that the theological concept of Spirit breathing actually pulls it right back to the story of Genesis. So you have this sort of neat idea, and when you think about that in theological terms, what this is implying through the Eucharistic prayer is that the work of God is circular, and it's happened since before time and continues, that it's the act of the Spirit moving and breathing new life into. And what's really interesting as a difference that you rightly point to, and I wondered if anybody might dig into that, is, of course, in the regular formulations for the Eucharistic prayer is now sanctify these gifts, so it's a directive. God sanctify these gifts. And in this language, it assumes that God's Spirit has already breathed over the earth, which reminds us that the sanctification is wider than even these gifts, right? And so it's a really subtle shift, but it's meant to awaken a little bit of question for us about how did this become sanctified? And one of the things that would be and is rather radical about this, of course, is that it raises the question of who can ask for that sanctification to be brought down. Whereas in traditional formulations, right, it's pay me. I stand up there and I help God make ordinary things holy, right? And this is just saying, Spirit, breathe. Maybe you could say that, right? You can't, but it's a great question. And it's a good moment for you to go, well, now what's my role if the Spirit's breathing? How much of that breath hits me? Anyway, other thoughts? Yeah. 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 So the idea for you that the liturgy shifted to something else wasn't necessarily that the new liturgy was better. It was just that it made you become more aware of the words you were saying. Yeah. 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 Well, and it occurs to me it can be really challenging too. I can't remember which prayer it was, but this past week, I think it was, there was one of them that I got completely out of whack. And I'm leading you all in it, and I realized that suddenly I was saying words from an older liturgy. And so there was this sort of jarring effect for me. I had to sort of stop and go, wait a minute, what, so it's really, I was fascinated by that and thought a lot about it afterward, of sort of, even in my own mind, where I'm going, no, we need to do a new liturgy and think about it. In my head, that neuro pathway is cut deep, and I started saying the incorrect prayer. So I wonder how many of you had a similar experience, and maybe just to invite a little difference, what was that like for you? Was. Can't slip one past you.
And I'm saying it, but and I do try to not do it by word. I do try to say the emphasis when I'm saying it. And I was like, oh, wait, I'm hearing this. Wait, what?
Yep.
I got some of those.
Yep.
I do like to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want us to spend a little time talking about that. I can't slip it.
The Lord's Prayer. I really like it. I prefer the word trespasses. I just like the word.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I'll give you the background. So thanks for pointing that out and calling me on the carpet. There was a different language for the Nicene Creed, and there was a different language for the Lord's Prayer. And there's probably some room to explore those prayers because I thought they were quite beautiful, but very different. And I knew this was going to be a big ask for particularly the 8 a.m. crew, okay? And I was not wrong. So after the first week of the prayer changes, we had a nice sit down, and what we discovered is that for the 8 a.m. group, one of the reasons that they were drawn to Rite 1, the oldest form of our prayer, is actually rather simple. And it's because that was the prayer they heard as children. That was the prayer they heard as adults, because that's the time they were growing up in. What we know of as Rite 2 came about when they were adults. And so that older language was really a bedrock for them. And hearing something different brought them to a place where suddenly the question was, is this my church? which is not to be looked at critically, but just to say that they were going, I don't know these words anymore, and they missed a connection to a younger period in their life. So that's pretty important, and it's important that they said it. All right? So I'm proud of them. It takes courage to do that. So we sat down, we talked about it. Ultimately, what we decided when they sat down is that there were only two things that they really wanted, and it was the Nicene Creed and the Lord's Prayer. All right? So I asked, if we change those things back to the prayer book formulation, do you want to keep doing this experiment? And everyone at the table go, of course. So here I am as the priest going, the issue is going to be that we're praying prayer that's not Rite One. No, just a couple of things. So they needed that creedal, that doctrine statement, and they needed to hear the Lord's Prayer in the words that you see in every translation of the Bible. So they got it. I didn't say anything to you all because I figured you'd be fine with it either way. And what I really wanted was for the 8 a.m. group to continue walking this path of discernment, which was huge, huge. All right, so for the past 4 weeks, no Rite One prayer since 1946. This is big. So give your 8 a.m.ers a hug and high-five them for their courage, and that's why you have it. So you like the language. Tell me what it is about those formulations for the Creed and the Lord's Prayer that speak to you, because I imagine it was probably a pretty welcome shift for all of you to go back to that. To the original Nicene Creed and Lord's Prayer. Temptation.
I can't remember what the word is now that was used in the other one. Evil something, but it didn't have the same meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Temptation is one of those words where it's something that is offered and then you choose to do it. And the other one is, it just resonates.
Right. Yeah. I'm also drawn to the word trespass.
Those two words are for me, particularly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So you've been grappling, Steve, with the idea that God could lead you into temptation. Yeah, right. Like, what a jerk. Yeah, so it's interesting, though, you know, these little bitty shifts actually point you back toward, I think, your own spiritual journey and how you come alongside the work of God. And forums like this are the right place to go, well, you know, I don't know about that temptation stuff. And so for me, the most modern translations about sin, you know, the sin we do, I have a real hard time with that because I don't think God leads us into sin either, or at least I have a different understanding of what that looks like for myself. It's all that struggle. So what else about the creed? There was a... Yes. Right out of left field there. Correct. In the more modern translations, just they shift that origin a little bit, and so it's a huge fight in the church, and so you know here's what I'll say comically. All right, we got two choices right now. I can try to explain to you the Trinity, or I can explain to you the patriarchy. Right? It's really the root of the battle, right? So the more modern translations are more playful with the Trinitarian formula, right? And they still recognize this triune God. But what they do is try to pull, in the more modern translations, closer again to the story of creation. The Spirit moves over the deep. The Spirit was a separate entity, at least in the mythic tales that began as the foundation of our faith. It was only later, under patriarchal disagreement at councils, that they begin to say, we really have to explain this three-headed God to the whole world. And they came up with the formulas that we know. And from that period, it became more and more difficult to describe and understand. I can't explain it to you. I don't know. What I know is I believe in the triune God, in God the Creator, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And I believe that they all act independently and together for God's kingdom. That's as close as I can get you to it, right? Now, a much better academic and theologian would have a very boring answer for you, and I commend all of their lectures online to your attention. But that is the main difference, and it's all about where that language derived itself, which is a bigger exploration for us. When you go back and you think about the political nature of the creed, of the Nicene Creed in particular, it's really difficult to separate out the politics, the polity of a patriarchal church from the language that we have. And this is what's at the very heart of the questions that people ask about that language and what can be adjusted and by whom. It's a question that really is a cry for justice for many people. And I'm not telling you that's my thought about it. It's people saying, I'm not sure about how this thing became to be, and I want to explore. You know, just like any other heretic from old, we were talking about this in the Monday night Bible study. Just like every other heretic, right? All of them, at one point or another, were seeking a better understanding of God. Sometimes they went off, veered into left field or right field. Sometimes they hit it right on the head. We killed a lot of them, right? And we get what we have. So I think the task is really doing battle with those spiritually. And there is no wrong or right answer. I think the only thing we're asked to do is to articulate what they mean to us, right? And invite that for others. One of the things that no one has said yet, and maybe you had this one loaded in the chamber, but the more modern formulation for the Nicene Creed, and something that speaks to my journey, is a change in the gendered language at the very end, particularly around the Spirit. This traditional formulation, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. With the Father and the Son, He is worshipped and glorified. He has spoken through the prophets. The more modern translation says, who with the Father and the Son, who is worshipped, who, not he. This is an important shift and one for greater exploration. The origin of that is all around the wisdom literature in the Bible. And if you go back and note, anytime you're looking at wisdom literature, whether it's the Book of Wisdom or any of the other Old Testament books that are about wisdom, the gendered language always selected for wisdom is she. Wisdom is feminine. Not feminine in the way that we might imagine. She didn't have long nails and high heels and wear pink dresses. Feminine in the nature of gentleness and grace. And so in the ancient church, wisdom, spirit, was always understood as feminine and didn't change until this happened. So the question is, why? And once I played with that language a little bit and said it a few times, it's just really hard for me to say he. And that may be offensive to some. So I load that one for you. Did anybody else have a reaction to that shift in gender? And if so, you know, what are your thoughts about it? Maybe you have strong feelings that it should be he. I want to hear that too. It's interesting. Oh, Lord. Stone her. Never thought of the Spirit having any gender. Yeah, yeah. Well, but it runs the risk, right? For many people, the idea that the language, the pronoun can shift is not only radical but offensive, right? That it's the formulation that you know, and for some people, the movement in the current moment to be less binary. And I don't pretend to know how to even address that, except to say, I know that this is something that I really struggle with as well. It's a question of how we identify God, and we make assumptions about that based on the way we live our lives. And so, although I like the more modern formulation, and it's more open in my mind to be curious about how God is, I also recognize that I identify as, and I understand the world in a binary way, and I struggle when it's non-binary. And I struggle to figure out how to use pronouns correctly. And this becomes a life, forces you into that conversation, right? So there's got to be room for that. There's got to be a space to discuss that. And also, I wonder what opportunities we have to move into that discomfort and to say out loud, I don't get it. Another parishioner came to talk to me specifically about that, and there was some language about, well, are we going to need to start saying they, them, or it? All right. So, no. And that question, problematic at baseline, but still valid in that it brings up a real question of, I don't know how to address a God that isn't gendered, right? And so I think we have an opportunity to talk about the binary world and wonder where we might be called into that conversation. I think about, for me, even though I really struggle with using non-binary language, I often wonder, particularly when I'm praying the Eucharistic prayer, how many people in a congregation are watching at home that don't identify as a he or a she, and don't identify as a brother or a sister, how they feel connected or disconnected to the God, the story that we tell in our prayers, the one that most often says, Father, He. What if children don't identify that way? What if some of our adults don't identify that way? And where might we be called into that uncomfortable conversation? It ties back, I think, maybe, what conversation we were having last week a little bit about what do the people in Glenview know of us? If we're looking for specific things, specific people, and they're not showing up, it's our job to ask the question, why? Why are they not here? I don't know what the world to do with this. But then again, I also can't say that it doesn't have anything to do with that. That's, I think, the work that we get invited into here. So, their thoughts about that, I'd welcome difference there as well. Yeah. 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 Great question. Yeah, where does it lead you? Yeah. Yeah. So where does it lead you? Probably nowhere. The result of this time of exploration is not an end product. As I said, at the end of this, you may all be right back at prayer 2, and you may go, that's it, Book of Common Prayer, we're good. My hope is that you can see that it is okay and to have difficult conversations that are theologically grounded, even when you're expressing difference, and that this space can hold that. The only goal that I have in this is that as a people, as experiences of the church is experimenting with liturgies here and there and language, just outright changing it, right? So a good example of this, a church I worked at before coming to Illinois, the altar book, that red book that sits up there, it was comical to read the book. They'd scratch stuff out and put sticky notes in it, changing language, and they were just doing that on the fly in the book, right? So the church is about the business of exploring these already, and that's the goal, I think, is for us to just have these conversations, to talk about what speaks to you and what doesn't. At the end of it, I'm going to compile a report for your next rector that says, here are the crazy things we did, and here's what the people of St. David said. But ultimately, may come in and go, you know, St. David's is a Right One church. At 8 a.m., at 10 a.m., at every service in between, all we ever do is speak the thous and thou shalt nots and must and wilts, and that's it. And they would have the right to do that. My guess is you would probably all have some pretty strong feelings about that. And so what I'm trying to do is cultivate the space for you to really express your desires and hopes for worship and what speaks to you and what doesn't. And hopefully you'll also have a little bit more ammunition for, you know, what is it that I want? You know a lot more prayers, or you will certainly by the time we're done with this. And you will also be exposed to Right One at 10 a.m. because it wouldn't be right for me not to do that, right? Because that's important to others. So, yes. Oh, go ahead, Graham, you got it. You are forgiven. Right. Sure. That's right. Right. The Bible is a library, and you all are witness to. No. So I just, you all bore witness to this, right? So Graham starts by saying he's not a theologian and then goes into a whole theological reflection of the Bible. You are theologians. Hear me. You are theologians. What you're doing in that one statement, Graham, is really expressing the fact that you can see the tension for the world in biblical passages. And what I think you reveal is your own continued journey with the areas of the Bible that you disagree with, which may or may not include that the world was created in 7 days, right? And you ask the question, does it even matter? No. Right? So you are doing that, and this process is just one more way to remind you all that you are theologians. You are not called into this space for me to teach you anything. My whole job is to be obsolete, or at least redundant. My whole job is to tell you over and over again that you've got the stuff. You already know how how to reflect. And that's what this does. So the language that you see in more expansive liturgies are about that same work that you point to. It's essentially about saying, what happens if I don't have to read the Bible as literal, that I can see it as the same thing happens there. And so even if you come with some disagreement, when you enter it with, but I want to figure it out, well, that's a welcome mat for everybody. So, but no, this doesn't go on for 10 years or something. It's going to go on for about, 8 more months. And then we're going to have a different conversation about, okay, well, where are we now? And again, you may say where we are is right back in the Book of Common Prayer on page 500 and whatever, or 300 and whatever it is, and that's Eucharistic prayer 2, and that's what we want. And I will then ask you the same question. Why? The answer for me, then I'll say to your next rector, the people of St. David's really love you, and ask them about it sometime, because they have a really beautiful connection to this language, and here are the places they're not connected. And I recommend you do this. And probably that's what they'll do. Right? Sure. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if I can, Lori, I think that's right. And I think one of the risks is that you can move into a place where everything becomes tense and confusing, particularly around the language of gender, right? That is one of the sticky spots in our social world right now, that the church is and has been about the business of trying to figure out where we're called, all right? So what I would say is, when in doubt, pray. Right? We are not called as a church to make all of this make sense. I don't believe that's ever been our call. And we don't need to make everything perfect for all people. That's not the mission of God's church. I think that what we are called to do is pray. And we're called to make sure that there is a space for all of God's creation here with us. And so I say be careful of the slippery slope of getting into the back and forth about what's correct or what's not. And the other thing I would say for all of us to continue praying about is, and I want to say very clearly, this experiment is not about finding the proper liturgy to attract people into this building. Got that? It's not. Right? If our motivation is to find something to trick people into coming into the room, we will lose, and we will be resentful. It's that moment. Surely God would have come out and spoken directly to me. That was our readings today, right? It's not our goal. One of the things I say all the time about church is it's weird. Church is weird. We do weird stuff all the time. We wear weird clothing. We say strange prayers. So get on with it. I think these liturgies are a way of God reminding us that we are allowed to be strange and to be playful with God and to keep being the church, to not be so worried about these polarizing topics, except to say that we have space for the conversation. But one of the statistics behind decline in church for people of a certain demographic, actually it has nothing to do with trauma, if you can believe it or not. So it has nothing to do with, I was forced to read the Bible and I don't like it, or, whatever else. When you ask people that are 40 years old or younger why they don't come to church if they're unchurched, one of the top answers is always about trust. They don't trust the church. They don't trust us with their money. They don't trust us with their time. Why? Well, it might have something to do with the way we create or don't create space for difference. And one of the misperceptions about church, often by the unchurched, is that we demand conformity. And we don't. So part of this experiment is just going, how do we build these spaces of dialogue and discomfort rather than conformity? So I don't know if that addresses anything there, but I just wanted to add that to. There's no language we're searching for. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to go back to what Brian
So that's a great point. And there may be people that already are quite concerned. And so I guess my question back to all of you is, where are they? Invite them. Invite them to the conversation. I hope that you all already see that there is nothing to be afraid of. There's no opinion that's going to be squashed in this space. The only goal we have is to talk. And at the end of the day, there remains here a question that is theological in nature. And the question behind that fear of, well, if one thing changes, everything changes, is really a questioning of God's grace. And one of the things that I really find quite fascinating, if not somewhat jarring in this particular period of 4 weeks, is the blessing and dismissal being one thing. Live without fear. Your Creator has made you holy, has always protected you, and loves you as a mother. Go in peace to follow the good road, and may God's blessing be with you always. Live without fear. God made you holy. So we are called to invite that voice in. We are called to soothe fear when it presents itself, to speak directly to the anxieties that any of our siblings in this church would have, to welcome them in, to say, tell us. Because at the end of the day, we're not talking about he or she. That's not really what we're fighting about or concerned about. We're trying to make sense of our relationship with God. And if we can't do that in church, well, there is no hope. Right? So invite differing voices. Let's ask them to speak. They have a gift of wisdom to give us as well. Their opinions, if they're different from the ones that you carry, will invite you to re-examine your own faith as well, and to examine what it is that they might be asking you to consider. And the whole point then is that you see each other the way God sees you, as holy. Sure. Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, and I think that's right. I think you hit that nail right on the head. And there are people that have left St. David's, right? There are people that left St. David's because you called me to be your priest, right? And I think, again, it becomes incumbent upon us when we see these things to ask the question, why? Right? That invites them back in and letting people know that we want you to come and speak. If you didn't care strongly, then you wouldn't be in church. So inviting those people to the conversation matters. It's a work that I do as well, but it's one that all of us are called to share. I mean, just yesterday, I sent an email to a visitor who came here very faithfully and then suddenly was gone. And 2 weeks passed, and I've not seen this person, and so I sent an email saying, hey, where'd you go? I missed you. You know? And that got a response back. Will the person come back? I don't know for sure. But I know that the reason that they decided not to stay, at least for now, is that they were picking up on some energy, that there were things we don't talk about. And they weren't sure if there was a space for them here. Right? Those are the conversations I want to have, because I know and you know that there is plenty. And so it pains my heart when and yet God is at work. But it takes us sometimes asking to get them back to the table. Yes, Susan. Sure. Mm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, that becomes the question I think that we can explore more here is what do you experience as moving toward the world? So that, at least as you asked that question, the thing I started thinking about is, okay, well, what is becoming worldly in the church? That's a conversation that we can dig into. Not today because of time, but I can tell you that would be a great topic for asking brave questions. What do we experience as becoming worldly here, right now, right? And what's real versus perceived? It could be that there's a thought that we're moving toward that we can discuss. But then, of course, there's the data, there's reality. What's actually happening in the building, what's actually being said, and we can do some work between reality versus perception. Now, theologically, it's also very interesting, the thought of our church as being separate from the realities of the world. Now, that's a really fun theological topic to dig into, especially when you consider the words of Jesus. And Jesus said that he didn't come to unite, but to divide. And what that meant was not that the church would be divided from the world and separate. The peace that we search for doesn't come to us in this period in life. And so it's a good and interesting thought to wonder, what is the purpose of church? If we come to church essentially to be anesthetized from the reality and pain of the world, well, that actually separate us from the very people that God calls us to serve.